The B-21 Raider question: is a weapons systems officer still necessary in the age of AI? A U.S. Air Force general has proposed swapping out one of the B-21 Raider's pilots for a dedicated weapons systems officer, but there are obvious downsides to the move. The 7 United States Air Force B-2 Spirit bombers that carried out strikes on Iran's nuclear program in June flew from Whiteman Air Force Base, Missouri, to the Middle East and back, spending 37 hours in the air. The CONUS-to-CONUS mission was the longest sortie the U.S. Air Force has conducted since it struck targets in Afghanistan following the September 11, 2001, terrorist attacks. The marathon-length flight was made possible by having 2 pilots share the workload. While having a pull-down cot, a microwave, a toilet, and a cooler filled with snacks likely added some creature comforts, no doubt the aviators were happy to be on solid ground. The Northrop Grumman B-21 Raider, now in development and on track to enter service later this decade, eventually replacing the B-2, could offer a similar configuration on the flight deck, with 2 pilots in the cockpit sharing flight duties. However, the former head of the U.S. Air Force Global Strike Command had some other ideas. Instead of having 2 pilots in the cockpit of the B-21 Raider, some within the Air Force top brass have suggested having 1 crew member instead serve as a weapons systems officer. Aviation Week, which had obtained a memo recommending the change, noted it would leave only 1 officer with a pilot rating on board at a time. The bombers are to be based in the United States and could be deployed on sorties as lengthy as the June mission to Iran and back. Air Force Global Strike Command has provided their recommendation regarding the B-21 crew composition to the headquarters. That document is pre-decisional. A decision has not been made, Lieutenant General Scott Plius, acting Vice Chief of Staff, told Aviation Week. The memo was written by former U.S. Air Force Global Strike Command Chief General Thomas Bussiere, who stepped down from that role on November 4. He had submitted his recommendation in August, writing that the B-21's potential missions could require a weapons systems officer on the flight deck. Unleashing the Raider's full potential demands a complex blend of skills: airmanship, weaponeering, electromagnetic spectrum operations, sensor management, real-time battle management and agile replanning in combat, the memo explained. For this reason, the B-21 will be crewed by 1 pilot and 1 weapons systems officer. Traditionally, most tactical bomber aircraft have not had a dedicated weapons systems officer, instead relying on the pilot to drop ordnance. However, as aircraft systems became more advanced and required a different skill set from flying the plane itself, the Air Force and the Navy began to introduce weapons systems officers to complement the pilot. The first aircraft to feature a weapons systems officer was the McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II, which entered service with the United States Navy in 1960. The Navy designated the backseat role as the radar intercept officer. When the Air Force adopted the concept several years later, it used the term weapons systems officer. The U.S. Navy's radar intercept officers went on to serve with the Grumman F-14 Tomcat before the term was retired in favor of weapons systems officer, which is now used by both services. Current 2-seat aircraft that feature a weapons systems officer position include the F-15E Strike Eagle and F-15EX Eagle II, as well as some variants of the F-16D Fighting Falcon and the F/A-18D and F/A-18F Super Hornets. The EA-18G Growler, the electronic warfare variant of the Super Hornet, has an electronic warfare officer who performs a comparable role. It isn't only fighters that have weapons systems officers in the cockpit. The B-52H Stratofortress and B-1B Lancer bombers each have weapons systems officers. However, it is the pilots who are on the flight deck, with the weapons systems officers seated behind them. The Raider likely doesn't have room to add a workstation for a 3rd crew member, so limiting the aircraft to 1 pilot, effectively eliminating crew's ability to trade off flying the aircraft for long-haul flights, could limit how much time it could spend in the air. That is something Bussiere understands, as he is a former B-1B and B-2 pilot. However, he wrote that it may be necessary given the threats the B-21 could face in future missions. The future of air power will be defined by the ability to project power into the most heavily defended airspace on Earth, Bussiere added. Aviation Week suggested a balance could be found. It noted that weapons systems officers are trained to fly the F-15E in emergency situations, and weapons systems officers could be similarly trained to operate the B-21 Raider in certain scenarios. That could include landing the aircraft if the pilot is unable to do so.